Hi everyone, this is Counseling 2250, Robinson Wood, Chapter 6, People of Spanish and Latino Descent. The Spanish, Portuguese, Indian, Asian, and African, so we're talking about a lot, but it pertains specifically to Latinx, Latino, Hispanic. La raza, the race of the people, that's what it refers to. Diverse and varied. There are the Puerto Ricans or Puertorriqueños. Again, I apologize for my enunciation. The Cubans or Cubanos, Central Americans and South Americans, Latin Americans, including the Dominicans or Dominicanos, and then, of course, Mexican Americans or the Mexicanos. Federal government definition of Hispanic or Latino is a person of Mexican, Puerto Rican, Cuban, South or Central American, or other Spanish culture of origin regardless of race. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about what you might see today, which is you might see someone who is clearly visually Mexican, let's say, right? But they'll consider themselves white, right? And you're like, why? You're not really white, are you? Or are you white? I don't know. What is going on? Part of it is the history of classification when it came to people. And I am going to talk to you about that in this slide, and it's a little confusing, and hence this is why it's also confusing to this day. All right, so in the 19th century, so from 1801 to 1900, Latinos and Hispanics were considered white. Okay, so you were white if you were Latino back in 1801 to 1900. And then in the 1930s, Mexican Americans were no longer considered white. They were considered Mexican. So it went from 100 years of you being white to now, no, you're actually not white, you're Mexican. And then 6 years later, in 1936, Mexican Americans were considered white again. Confusing, right? And this is why sometimes you'll see paperwork that says non-Hispanic white, right? Because some Hispanic people or Latinx people consider themselves white. So when they say non-Hispanic white, that means like white people from Europe, not from Latin America. Does that make sense? And then of course, Latino, Latina, and also you'll hear me say the word Latinx, refers to people with Spanish ancestry. Many Latinx people prefer to be called by their country of origin instead. So instead of saying Latino, they'll say, I'm actually Cuban, or I'm actually Mexican, or Brazilian, or Argentinian, as opposed to saying the word Hispanic or the word Latino, because it's kind of loaded, right? And so in this chart right here, you'll see that the preferred or volunteered Hispanic or Latino, so Dominicans prefer to call themselves Dominicans over white, but then you'll also see Cubans prefer to call themselves white over being Cuban. So it's really interesting. Obviously, these statistics will change over time, but I just want to show you an example at this time in place in this survey. This is how people were identifying. So when you hear people who are Latinx and they identify as white, now you can sort of see why some do and some don't. Partly it's because of the way that they were raised, how long they have been in America, and many other factors as well. But this is one confusing reason why this also has influence on self-identification in the Latinx community. So let's talk about racial diversity in this population. It is connected to political movements, slavery, family, conquest, defeat, geographic movement, love, and war. So there are reasons why this group is very diverse, okay? Obviously, even slavery, as we know now, and we have known for a while, is that sometimes the slaves and the masters basically had sexual intercourse, and often called rape. Let's be honest, right? The master is raping their slaves. And then, of course, then the slaves have children who are biracial. And then, of course, this is why the diversity of the Latinx population is so varied. Okay, Hispanic or Spain, the country from which the conquistadors hailed, they met the Arawaks, the Mayans, the Aztecs, and the Incas. And from there, they also ruined their lives and also really, really affected their populations. Okay, it's definitely a longer conversation to have than in this lecture, obviously. So if you are interested, please do more research to see, you know, how the conquistadors really did ruin the native people who were living here. brought slaves from Africa to the Caribbean, the colonies in South America, as well as we have talked about before. The Philippines are Spanish encountered Asian people in 1522. The Filipinos are categorized as Asians, but do have Spanish ancestry because of this. And I'll let you know that as I was growing up, I actually grew up in a very heavily Filipino community because I grew up in Southern California. And I have heard Filipinos who will identify as Spanish or as Asian, one or the other, or both. Okay, and some of them are very, very adamant about exactly how they identify. And part of that is again because of the interesting history, the sad history, the exciting history of the people. Spanish and indigenous Indian people, if they got together, they were called the mestizos. There is also a class ranking. So Spanish would be the highest ranking. The mestizos are basically a combination of indigenous people as well as Spanish. And then there's the pure Indians, which have the lower ranking. And obviously you can see why, levels of oppression, the levels of dominance that they feel they need to have over other people. There's also the La Castas, or the caste system. The caste stigma on darker skinned people and supported discriminatory treatment. So if you've heard of the term of colorism, that's partly what we're talking about as well, right? Spanish conquistadors and Portuguese used caste systems to dominate and demean indigenous and African slaves. Ensured that the free labor of indigenous and African people as well, right? If you dominate a group of people, then you can use them because you are threatening their lives, threatening them with violence and stuff like that so that they remain slaves, right? There's also the peninsulares, which are native-born Spaniards. And then there are the criollos, which are the American-born Spaniards. There's the mestizos, which is European and indigenous ancestries. There's the mulattoes, which are European and black ancestries. And there's the zombos, which are the indigenous and black ancestries. So there's the Indios and then the Negros, which is the lower ones right there, right? So you can see in this slide the order of the caste system, and how if you were European full blood, you would be the highest. If you're European full blood but born in America, you would be the second, and then so forth and so on. And you can see how the people who are in the lower systems are living in poverty, live as slaves, as being controlled and oppressed by the conquistadors. And as we were talking about colorism, there's an idea called the blanqueamiento, which is basically the whitening of the people, encourage the intermarriage of lighter-skinned people, and as an attempt to suppress African or Amerindian bloodline. So basically, they're like, okay, we need to kind of spread thin black lines and then also Indian lines, right, or Native American lines. So we're going to put our Western bloodlines into this culture to reduce the authenticity of who black people are. It's basically dilute, right? And it sounds really awful, and it was very awful, but definitely the colorism thing was a major thing, and it still exists to this day. People aspire to achieve acceptance and elevate their status by trying to look more like European Spaniards. Latin American governments encourage whitening policies. White Europeans immigration was encouraged. White prostitutes were sent to heavily populate indigenous and African areas so that they would have babies that were then, biracial and lighter skin colored people. Venezuelans welcomed Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, German, French, and English people into their countries so that they would, again, whiten the population. High rates of intermarriage led the Spanish to implement the ideology of the mestizaje, which is all people, regardless of ancestry, were of mixed descent. There's the Garafinas, which were slaves from Ghana, were taken to Central America, and then they spread towards the Caribbean, the Belize, Guatemala, and Honduras as well. So you can see, again, the amount of people, slaves, that were brought into different countries and then mixed and basically were made to basically procreate with people who were lighter skinned so that we would reduce the amount of darker skinned people. It's an interesting history, right? Sad as well. And I hope that you acknowledge this and talk about this. Obviously, we're not blaming anyone currently right now, but we need to acknowledge that a lot of this type of violence occurred in our history. Now let's talk about the migratory patterns from Mexico. Mexico is one of the largest sources of new immigrants to the United States. In early 1900s, need for cheap labor to work in the U.S. agriculture. Why? Because Mexico's harsh economic conditions, high unemployment, and close proximity to the U.S. is the reason why they were encouraged to come to America. In 1821, Mexico won its independence from Spain. And then in 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Mexico loses 50% of their territories to the U.S. Again, right? Conquistadors fighting, the colonialists fighting, all that stuff mixing together. And then suddenly Mexico loses half of its country, right? Um, we're talking about losing Texas, Mexico, or I'm sorry, New Mexico, California, Arizona, Nevada, and half of Colorado. So during this treaty, Mexico lost all of those areas, which is where those areas are now known as. Let's talk about demography as well. In 2011, 53% of all foreign-born persons were born in Latin America and in the Caribbean. 17% of the US population, so this is about 55.4 million people, are Latino. Note, difficult with statistics because there was a time when Latinos identify as white. So remember what we were talking about before. So this is why the numbers might be a little different than it really is, or it truly is. It doesn't mean that you can't believe it, but we need to know that when we surveyed the people during this time, this is what the percentages were. But we also need to consider the fact that there was a time period where Latinos considered themselves white and then were not considered white. So then that also adds to maybe a variability of the actual real number. Here's a Latino breakdown. 63% are Mexican. Puerto Ricans are 9%. Cubans 3.5%. Central Americans, so this is Belize, Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Panama were 8%. And of course, Guatemala is the largest group of that. And then the South Americans, which are Argentinian, Bolivian, Brazil, Colombia, Chile, Paraguay, Peru, Uruguay, and Venezuela, is 5.5%. Note is Colombian is the largest group in this one. The book also talks about fertility rates. It's really interesting. Latina is 2.4, African is 2.1, non-Hispanic whites is 1.8, and Asians is 1.8. The median age of Latino is 27, non-Latino US is 37. And then 1/3 of Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, and Hondurans are children. So you see that there's a lot of children within these groups as well. Now let's talk about geography. Brazil. Official language is Portuguese. So if you meet a Brazilian, they will most likely not speak Spanish. They will speak Portuguese, which is a different language. Okay. Millions of people from Argentina and Costa Rica are not of Spanish or Indian descent. They are actually European and Antillean nations coming from Europe escaping Nazi oppression. The other countries speak Spanish with various dialect differences. So Spanish mainly speaks Castellanos, Chicano Mexicans speak Bocho, some speak English and Spanish, some speak just Spanish, and some just speak English. So now we're talking about, understanding the language and the areas and locations. In 2010, 41% of Latinos lived in the West, 36% lived in the South, 14% of Latinos lived in the Northeast, and 9% of Latinos lived in the Midwest. So the majority will be living either in the West or in the South. And this makes sense, right? We live in the West Coast, and there are plenty of Latinx people here. The highest populations of Latinos or Latinx is California, Texas, and Florida. Puerto Ricans occupy New York, Florida, and New Jersey, and Cubans live in Florida, California, and New Jersey. Now let's talk about social, psychological, and physical health issues. Have been both the oppressor and the oppressed, social oppression, conquest, liberation, and struggle. So this population has experienced both. 27% of U.S. Latinos have 9th grade education or less. In the U.S., typically it's 5%. 60% of U.S. Latino graduate high school, when U.S. is typically 88.6. South Americans have an 84.5% high school graduation rate. Central Americans have a 53% high school graduation rate, and Puerto Ricans have a 71% high school graduation rate. College attainment for Latinos in the U.S. is 10%. Community college attainment is on the rise, and language is a major barrier when it comes to going to school. People enroll in a 2-year college or a 4-year college. The factors are gender. So these are the reasons why people might be part of school and college is gender, perceptions of their parents' educational expectation. So what their parents expect them to do. Students' English self-concept, enrollment in high school calculus, perceptions that most of the students' peers plan on attending college. So these are the reasons why Latinx people go to school. Males, 2-year college more often, while females go to 4-year colleges. If parents did not value education, they might go to a 2-year college. If parents valued education, they would probably go to a 4-year college. If students have a strong self-concept in science, they will also go to a 4-year college as well. Let's talk about unemployment rates. For Latinos, it's 6.8 compared to 3.4 in America. Obviously, these numbers are going to change, especially, let's say, during this pandemic and stuff like that. But these are the old statistics that we have from this current textbook. Puerto Ricans having the highest rates, then Central Americans, and then South Americans. People who are of Latinx descent often work in service occupations. They do operating or labor positions as well, and many male Latino workers who newly arrive in the U.S. work in construction. Although construction pays well, many Latinx who are foreign-born live in poverty. The highest rates of poverty are Dominicans, and then Puerto Ricans, and then Mexicans, and then Colombians, which have the lowest poverty rates. Latinos also have the highest probability of being medically uninsured. So we're talking about people who have to live with diabetes, high blood pressure, and obesity. HIV is also another area that we need to talk about when it comes to the Latinx population. 1 in 36 Latino men will be diagnosed with HIV. 1 in 36, you guys. 1 in 106 Latina women will be diagnosed with HIV. High rates of unprotected male-to-male sexual contact is one reason why. The median outcome for Latinos is about 40,963 compared to the US would be about 10,000 more than the Latinx. Latinx are also more likely to own their own homes than to rent. Now let's talk about migration and enculturation. So stress factors. The degree of acculturation, so the degree of how well you live in the dominant country will potentially let you know how stressed they are. The amount of coping with stress resources, facilities with the English language, which basically means their ability to speak English, degree of cohesiveness with family members. So are they with their families? Are they in a loving family, a productive family, or are they not? And then of course, length of time people have lived in the US as well. There is no solid social network, English language, intergenerational conflicts, and overcrowded and unsafe living conditions in neighborhoods also add to the stress that Latinx people may feel. Colorism, which is something that we had talked about in the history, differential and often inequitable treatment because of skin color hue. The more a person resembles an Indian, the more prejudice and discrimination he or she or they will encounter. Similar to African American experience as well. So if you understand Black culture, African American culture, you'll hear about colorism as well, right? And we'll talk about that as we go into that chapter as well. But I just want to warn you and let you know that it happens in all cultures. Asian culture also has colorism as well. And sometimes I meet students who don't realize that. And I think that's really interesting. Now let's talk about cultural orientation and values. Cooperation rather than competition is stress. Extended family and friendship networks are held in high esteem, which is the basis of Latinx culture. Family members feel a sense of obligation to provide for and receive support from one another, both emotionally and materially. So what that is kind of showing you is that Latinx culture is very, very collectivist. Right? Have you heard of the word collectivist? We've talked about it before, right? And this is what we're talking about, is the extended family, the community, all helping each other. That's very collectivist. Whereas Western culture is much more individualistic. You're on your own, okay? So part of the collectivism is this term called familiosmo, which involves a strong identification and attachment to nuclear and extended families. So that means like your uncles and aunts, or your cousins and all that stuff are all included. Loyalty, reciprocity, which basically means I help you, you help me, and solidarity among members of the family are associated with this attachment. So again, the word is collectivist, right? Individual goals are subordinated to the larger group, which means personal small goals of each person is not as important as how well the whole group is working or how well the whole group is existing. Now let's talk about compadrazos, which are godparents. I'm sorry if my enunciation is really bad. There's also compadres, which are special friends who often act as co-parents. And I'll also note that a lot of these are the masculine terms. There's also the feminine terms as well. But this is what the book is referring to. So I just want to acknowledge that it does exist, men and women. Anyways, dignidad, which is personalismo and respecto, pride for the people, strong sense of self-worth and personal dignity. So personalismo is orientation in which the person is more important than the task. Warm and interpersonal relationships are valued, while respecto is sensitivity to a person's position and creates a boundary within which conversation should be contained to avoid conflict. So there's a level of respect depending on who you are, the hierarchy, right? Family structures are formal and hierarchical, which means there's different levels, right? Respect for elders and males is the top. Machismo, I'm sure you've all heard of machismo, is the stoicism. Stoicism basically means not showing emotion, right? Like enduring any type of painful thing. So there's a need for dignidad and respecto in machismo. There's also the female counterpart to it, which is called embrismo, that talks about women's strength, perseverance, and flexibility and sacrifice. Family roles, men outside, women inside the house. Preserving the Spanish language is also very important. There's also simpatia, which is value of smooth and harmonious interpersonal interactions. So being able to communicate with other people with respect and with, nuance and, a professional way of speaking or a polite way of speaking. Similar to Asians in living units and children living at home until marriage. So it shares that commonality, and also Asians are also known as being collectivist societies as well. So there's obviously going to be some things that are shared. There's also the bien educados, which are polite and well-mannered people. There's also the malcriados, which are not well-behaved, poor parenting. There's also the Marianismo, which is basically based on the Catholic cult of the Virgin Mary, which dictates that when women become mothers, they attain the status of Madonnas and, accordingly, are expected to deny themselves in favor of their children and their husband. So this concept is about, once a woman has children and she's married, she now has to give up her life, basically, and take care of her children and her husband, basically. So there's this concept, and it becomes very, very conflicting for people who might be acculturated to Western culture, right? Where they're like, I don't want to be this, but they feel a sense of obligation because they were raised this way, or guilt because they feel this way. So this is why it's really interesting to talk to millennials, to talk to Gen Z, to talk to Gen X and stuff, because we're talking about the fact that people now have to balance the two. Do we choose one or the other? Do we mix it? How does it work if we mix it? How do our parents see us if we don't? And all that other interesting things that can become the combination of who you are. Now let's talk about church and faith. It's a crucial role and shape core beliefs of sacrifice, charitability, service to others, and long suffering. I'm sure many of you who are listening who are of Latinx descent were probably raised Catholic, right? And how important church and faith was emphasized. There's also the curanderos, which are spiritual and herbal folk healers, primarily women. They practice Native American arts. There's also the espiritistas, which are spiritual guides, and then santeros, which are worshippers of Catholic saints and of African gods. And remember, we talked about how there was a mixture historically, right? So there's also going to be a mixture of spirituality as well. And these are the different ones that you might hear from your clients. Now let's talk about folk illnesses, which are supernatural causes. Such things as empacho, which is bad upset stomach, nervios, which is nerves, and mal de ojo, which is evil eye. There's also sustos, which is fright. It comes from medieval Spanish, but also African and indigenous beliefs as well. And then there's the ataques de nervios, which are screaming uncontrollably, crying, trembling, heat in the chest rising to the head, verbal or physical aggression, sometimes fainting, and suicidal gestures. So these are what people see as supernatural causes. So something weird is going on, something spiritual is going on. And so these are some of the terms that you actually might hear from your clients. Now let's talk about fuerza de espíritu, which is toughness, determination, and willpower. So a strong person can confront a problem directly and be active in resolving it, thereby delaying the admission that help may be needed, right? So the strength of the spirit, the toughness, right? There's also the controlarse, which is controlling oneself, including aguantarse and then resignarse, which is basically, let me define that, aguantarse, being able to withstand stress during bad times, which is kind of like resiliency, right? And then resignarse, which is resigning oneself and accepting fate. So that means kind of like, okay, this is what's happened, so what do we do from now, right? Where do we move on from here? So resigning the fact that this is happening, where do we go? There's also sobreponerse, which is imposing one's own will or overcoming circumstances. A weak person will have little or no self-control and show orgullo, which is pride, and vergüenza, which is shame. Okay, so sobreponerse basically means imposing one's will and overcoming a circumstance. Family name is also very important in Latinx culture. Family constellation is loyal, committed, and responsible to each other and has a strong sense of honor. So when we say family constellation, it means all the different people that are part of the family make up this network. Kind of like when you look in the stars, there's a constellation that creates this, like the Leo or the Big Dipper, right? So we have the same thing, like all these different people together make this group. Let's talk about Latino ethnic identity development. So we talked about this before with the Native Americans, right? There's different levels of acculturation in identity. So now we're going to talk about that here with the Latinx population. Latino integrated means able to embrace the fullness of their Latino identity and integrate this into their identities, other identities such as class, profession, and gender. Okay, so they have their Latinx identity, but they're also able to integrate and work with it with the other things as well. Latino identified is pan-Latino identity with a view of race or la raza as uniquely Latin, deep understanding of history of political struggle, and a desire to be united with other Latinos in racial unity. So this is Latino identified. The next one is called subgroup identified, which sees themselves as distinct from white people, but do not necessarily identify with other Latinos or with people of color. So they're kind of just existing, right? They see everyone, but they don't necessarily side with one or the other. There's also Latino as other. That is, see themselves as people of color, maybe a function of biracial or multiracial status, ambiguous phenotype. Ambiguous phenotype basically means when you look at someone, you can't tell what kind of ethnicity they are, right? Or dominant constructions of race. Sees themselves as a minority, but not white. No identification with Latino culture norms or with white culture, and an understanding of Latino history and culture is missing. Okay, so that's Latino as other. There's also undifferentiated, which means they see themselves as simply people with a color-blind eye. So they don't really see themselves as anything. They're just humans. And then there's also white identified, which sees themselves as white and thus superior to people of color. And you can see that because of colorism, because of history and stuff like that, the dominant culture is Western culture is white. So white people automatically may think that they're better, or the group anyways, because the rules and everything are for them and don't apply necessarily or put in consideration people of color, right? Again, we are not blaming anyone who's listening to this who may be white or Caucasian. We're just saying that, as a group, collectively, it is seen as the Caucasian or dominant group is seen as superior than the others. Now let's talk about implications for mental health professionals. Mental health services are not sought because in-group member reliance for help comes from family or church. So they don't necessarily seek out help outside of the family or the church. That's where they go first. Services that are culturally insensitive is a reason why they don't. Lack of Spanish-speaking behavioral health providers, which is why we encourage in people in rehab and counseling and psychology, if you speak Spanish, it's so needed, right? Because we want to be able to serve people who need the help who are Spanish speakers. There's also the term called falta de respeto, which is lack of respect when working with clients who are older than the clinician. Sometimes you'll say things like, hi, John, when really you want to say, hi, Mr. Navarro. Does that make sense? So we're talking about respect, right? So when you greet people, we want to encourage you to greet people with respect. And if they want you to call them John or whatever it is, then they'll say, call me John, right? But when you first meet them, you would want to call them, hi, Mr. Navarro. You'll see that also in Asian cultures as well, this level of respect and hierarchy that you need to acknowledge.